So if you see the front cover, which you can't, the front cover has a picture of some white kids, if you like, arm in arm with some Sikh kids. And this is the sort of London I imagined, or sorry, this is my London, the London I grew up in, and what really was a London for me, and probably for much of the population of London that lives in the capital today. And my experience was slightly different. I mean, my background is Greek Cypriot, as you probably may have worked out. And I grew up in Crouch End. I don't know how much of the audience is Londoners and how much comes from further afield in North London. And in the 60s, and a lot of my friends were everything. And so in a sense, this seemed a bit of an inevitable book for me to write. And I was approached by the publisher to write it over many years, and I finally found time to do it. And you know, it came out earlier this year. So one of the key arguments that I put forward in the book, and now you're supposed to be seeing a picture of the Empire Windrush, is that multicultural London doesn't begin in 1948 with the arrival of the Empire Windrush, but has an incredibly long history. And of course, you need to go back to the foundation of London, and it's founded by the Romans, as you know, well, an immigrant group, or invaders, or foreigners, whatever phrase you prefer to use. And probably what's even more important for us is the fact that Rome was a multicultural city, and some of the people who moved to London weren't, you know, Italians or, you know, born in Rome or whatever, but came from throughout the empire. So in a sense, you know, from its foundation, it's been a multi-cultural city. And I think that's one of its key distinguishing factors. So, you know, we talk about multicultural Britain. I mean, we also talk about, you know, multiculturalism being a global phenomenon. But I mean, I don't think there's any, so, you know, you can talk about New York, you know, that may or may not be as diverse as London or other Chicago or Paris or Frankfurt, but none of them have the longevity of experience of migration, which London does. And I think that's completely unique. Maybe the only city that does would be Rome, but I mean, I don't think that has the continuity of diversity which London does. So, you know, I mean, I keep stressing this uniqueness, you know, which is key to our understanding of how London evolves. Of course, there's some periods when it's less diverse than others. So, you know, in the Anglo-Saxon period, perhaps, or in the early modern period, perhaps. You may think in the 19th century, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So, you know, it's this continuity. The other thing which I stress in the book is which I've just mentioned, is the level of diversity. So, you know, if you follow the myth of multicultural Britain being born in 1948, then you may suggest it's an African, Caribbean, and then subsequently South Asian development, which might apply to the country as a whole. Of course, if you live in London today, or if you lived in London in the Victorian period, you recognise that that's just way too simplistic. And, you know, I mean, in contemporary London, over half of the population is either first or second generation migrant. About a third of the population is born abroad. And of course, since 2004, it's EU migration, which has changed everything. And it may be that London it is true that London has never experienced the type of, the scale of migration over the last 15 years ever before, if you like, although, you know, maybe in the 1840s, Irish migration was very significant. So when we think about this continuity, you know, there's two areas maybe which have over centuries had a very significant migrant population, and they sort of in popular discourse, they're viewed in two different ways. So the first one is the East End of London, and that would probably be regarded as the classic slum area, if you like. So when people speak negatively about migration, or when they spoke negatively of migration, probably still speak negatively of migration, then the classic slum, I know that's the title of a book about Salford, but in the London case, it would be the East End of London. And one of the reasons why it's a slum in this popular imagination is because it's a migrant destination. And again, the longevity of migration is quite extraordinary, from the 17th century Huguenots through a whole variety of Jewish communities to Bangladeshis. One of my colleagues, Anne Kirshen, has focused on Spitalfields and on those three groups. But I mean, I would also point out that the East End was a significant area of German settlement during the 19th century. So that's one of the classic areas of migration, the long-term areas of migration. The other one is the West End stroke Soho. And in the popular imagination, Soho has been imagined in a different way. And if East End means slum, then Soho means cosmopolitanism. It's the place where you go, in the late 19th century or today to experience exotic food. That's where essentially the foreign restaurant in Britain is born at the end of the 19th century. And sorry, you can't see my picture of Appenrot, which is a German patisserie which existed before the First World War. However, what's happened since 1945, and again, this brings us to the uniqueness of London, is that every area of London is multicultural. And you might imagine that some areas have more members of more migrant groups than others. So maybe Wembley is Gujarati, maybe Southall is Sikh, maybe Haringey, Palmer's Green is Greek and Turkish Cypriot. But it's the whole capital, as you know. And if you live in London, then you probably, like me when I was a child, just need to look at who your next door neighbours are. And I think, I imagine there's very few other cities where you can live next to someone of one group on one side and someone from another group on another side. So when I was growing up, our neighbours, one of the things that sticks in my mind is that the people who lived opposite us in 61 Uplands Road in Crouch End was the people who lived directly opposite. It was a white male married to an Indian woman who wore a sari. So that was quite fascinating for a 5 or 6 year old child. And then next to them was a West Indian family, and next to them was another Greek Cypriot family. And then eventually there was Portuguese, there was Indian, West Indians. I mean, and it's obviously the same today, and probably even more so. The only thing that's happened is that the groups have become even more diverse than they were in the 1960s and the 1970s. Just one point I'd really like to stress. I mean, I guess lots of you who are listening to this may be white liberals, and maybe you can't appreciate the importance of religion. But the one thing that really identifies the diversity of London, or really key, is the diversity of religion. So one of my chapters in the book, let me read it out, the proper title is called Christians, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs. So even within that, that's too simplistic. So when you're talking about Christians, you're talking about Irish Catholics, you're talking about Greek Orthodox after the Second World War. And one of the key identifiers of diversity in the 19th century was the range of religion. Of course, again, it's become even more diverse in the post-war period, and certainly since the post-60s. And I think if I was going to give you one key indicator of the diversity of London, it would be religion. And it may be something that you don't actually think of, but I mean, you know, obviously London may superficially seem as extraordinarily secular society, but you know, migrant groups don't actually fit into that description very easily. So then one of the other key arguments of my book is that, you know, I've banged on about the ethnic diversity and the religious diversity, but one thing which I think again makes London very unique is the range of social groups with migrant backgrounds. So, you know, in the popular imagination or popular discourse, popular negative discourse, immigrants are cheap labor. You know, maybe most migrants move into London or anywhere else in order to carry out work that nobody else wants to do. I mean, that's a classic pattern. However, some of them never make it. So, you know, the slide I now have in front of me is a book called Die Deutsche Kolonie in London, published by someone called Heinrich Dorgil. And he had the classic phrase, which maybe you may have heard before, is that lots of Germans in the 1880s moved to London, imagining that it's paved with gold, but ultimately they fall on hard times, and then, you know, fall to the bottom of London society, and you know, a lot of the homeless are from migrant backgrounds. And the other thing I've got on my slide here is in order to help the Germans who didn't make it, if you like, as a group called the Society of Friends and Foreigners in Distress was set up, and despite its name, it was basically all the German pastors of the numerous German churches, around 20 that existed in London by 1914, which again brings us back to religion. So yeah, we really wish you could see this slide, because it's a picture of an Irish navvy and West Indian bus drivers. So the Irish, I mean, I don't know if we can say that the Irish navvy built London, but the Irish navvy certainly was central in the building of London. You know, maybe you know this from the Victorian period, but you know, this continues right up until way into the post-1945 period, way into the 1960s and 1970s. So when I was doing the research, I looked at one set of interviews of well, I mean, they weren't just Irish. I mean, they were a whole range of groups, English, Scottish, and Commonwealth, who helped to build the Barbican, for example. So, you know, and I guess you know about, you know, the cheap labour, and I'll come back to this, or if we use that word, I'll come back to this in a minute. You know, obviously this is important. So if you were going to develop a hierarchy of who does what with regard to their ethnicity, then black people tend to work in occupations towards the lower end of the scale. Well, so that's what the situation. So I'm just reading one of the comments. If we move on to so what I've looked at so far is those who didn't make it, cheap labour, if you like. And one of my other chapters is entitled "A City of Hawkers, Shopkeepers, and Businessmen." So when you leave the lecture, if you go into a shop somewhere on your way home, well, actually, sorry, you're all in your homes already. But when you go out tomorrow, there's a good chance that your local shopkeeper, he's probably going to be a migrant or someone of migrant origins. And again, this has long-term historical origins. So the picture that I have in front of me from Mayhew, who Mayhew is the most, you can't really understand, well, actually, I don't think you can understand London without reading Henry Mayhew, and you certainly can't understand Victorian London without reading Mayhew. So I have a picture of a Jewish old clothes man in front of me, which you can find in Mayhew if you want to look at that later. And the Jewish old clothes man arrives in the late 17th century when Jews are readmitted to Britain, and he's a universal phenomenon throughout Europe right until the end of the 19th century. And I guess this is a hawker who's working on small profit margins and for whom things might go wrong. Or on the other hand, they could experience social mobility. So you have the hawkers who are extremely normal in Victorian London, but I remember from my childhood, and maybe some of you do, these magic Sikhs who used to come to your door with their suitcases and used to open these suitcases and had these amazing variety of things which they tried to persuade my parents to buy. So the hawkers did survive right into the 1970s, maybe into the 1980s. But what happens by the end of the 19th century is that migrants increasingly become shopkeepers. So I've got a picture in front of me of a German butcher in South London, C. Goetz. And there were German butchers and bakers all over London, and in fact all over the country. In the post-war period, and then there's all sorts of Jewish businesses in the post-war period. If you, depending on what part of London you live in, I mean, I don't really need to say this to you if you live in London, there's a vast variety of different migrant groups who own shops. And I know that the Conservative Party keeps saying that small businesses are the backbone of the British economy, which I never used to pay much attention to until I did the research for this. But small migrant shopkeepers are the backbone of the London economy, and without them it would basically collapse. And they fall into two groups. On the one hand, you have those who sell stuff to the ethnic majority. Well, I don't know what the ethnic majority is in London, but well, to other Londoners, no matter what their ethnic group is. Or there's there's obviously migrant markets, which allows shops to take off, and you can take this back to the Jewish East End in the 19th century, and you can bring it up to contemporary South Asian shops as well. So migrants operate at that level and are absolutely fundamental for the migrant economy. I mean, one of the things I've done a lot of work on, of course, is migrant eateries of various varieties, and migrants are absolutely central to the development of eating out in London's history, and in the history of the UK as a whole. So the three pictures I have in front of me are an Italian ice cream vendor in the London street from the 1880s. So I think we can say that Italians introduced ice cream into London. I also have a picture of a fish and chip shop, and the woman who's serving the fish and chips has a remarkably dark complexion, and I'm no idea what her ethnic background is, but I am assuming she's Jewish, but I mean, she looks Indian. But Jews are absolutely fundamental for the development of fish and chips, and it's an East End phenomenon, and it's born in the East End, as you can find out by reading my book on the subject. And then if you're from Ealing, I have a picture of a restaurant called Monty's, which claims it's Nepalese, although the food is remarkably similar to what you eat in a normal Bangladeshi restaurant, if you like. So, you know, this is continued with this origin going back to the 19th century. And again, it may be because migrants are prepared to move into London, set up their own businesses, work hard, and they make it, if you like. So, you know, that's quite important. Right, so we've got those who don't make it, we've got cheap labor, we've got various types of hawkers and shopkeepers, and then we also have one of the other chapters is entitled The International Bourgeoisie. And the international bourgeoisie in London, again, goes back to the 18th century and is incredibly diverse. So what I have in front of me is a picture of Edgar Speyer. And Edgar Speyer was the London representative of a global banking firm with branches in Frankfurt and New York as well. And in fact, it comes to he's someone I very much admire because he was hounded during the First World War, and he basically stuck two fingers up to Britain and London and just left the UK, unlike a lot of other naturalized Germans who knuckled under. So I mean, I you know, it's quite and he's symptomatic of the role of German Jews, especially in the development of merchant banking. But there's also a very important Greek community in 19th century London, which is connected with shipping in particular. And then the other picture I've got here is Jenny Lind, the 19th century soprano. And London is, so, you know, the UK or London may never have produced Mozart or Wagner or Beethoven, but the other key to understanding London from the Victorian period is the size of the bourgeoisie. It's got the biggest bourgeoisie of any city in the world until probably very recently. And therefore there's a demand for classical music. So while classical music may be made on the continent, it's performed in London, and it's performed for the English bourgeoisie, and it's performed by, you know, a very large variety of foreign musicians, Italians and Germans in particular, from the late 17th until the 19th century. The final slide I would have shown you has a picture of Liam Brady, Clyde Best, Ian Wright and Didier Drogba, which, because there's a chapter called, well, Fighters and Footballers. I won't deal with the fighters this evening. And I mean, the development of football, of cosmopolitan football in London, is quite interesting because it reflects a whole series of other developments. So if we begin with Liam Brady, he's symptomatic of the role of the Irish in London, actually. And you know, his career was really in the 1970s, and up to the 1970s, Irish players are really important, especially for Arsenal and Tottenham. Then Clyde Best I found very interesting because he was a West Ham player, and I think he was the first black footballer I saw on TV. And people like Ian Wright are about the same age as me, and they probably were inspired by Clyde Best. And I remember very clearly how unique Clyde Best was in his West Ham shirt. And then, but he's still essentially a working class person. So is Ian Wright even. By the time you get to Didier Drogba, people like Didier Drogba, Thierry Henry, and their successors are essentially part of the international bourgeoisie because of the way in which football's evolved. So, I mean, I'll just make some concluding remarks about what my book's about, really. So one of the things I've tried to stress throughout is the level of diversity, but the level of diversity has to be understood in all sorts of ways. First of all, the different types of ethnic groups, the wide range of ethnic groups. Secondly, the religious diversity is absolutely fundamental. And thirdly, the social diversity. And I mean, that aspect of London, the first and third, probably all three of them just seem quite unique to me. And I haven't found any other examples. What causes all this migration? Well, it's the global position of London. I mean, for most of the last 2 centuries, it's the biggest city in the world. It's the heart of empire. And actually, one portion of the international bourgeoisie I missed out was the fact that the British Empire is destroyed from within, from London. So people like Gandhi come to London in order to become educated, and that sets them on the path of, or is key in their national awakening, if you like. So, you know, because of its importance and the economic, I mean, so it's the, you know, you all know this, it's the globality, the political power, the economic power attracts all these vast ranges of people. And just the final point I'd like to make is the longevity of migration to London is, you know, another issue which makes it quite unique. So I think I'll probably stop there.
That's great. Thank you very much. Let me just put myself, let's just get back onto that and get myself back on here. Just to explain why we lost the images, and to apologize for that again. The professor's normal computer blew up about 5 minutes before we were due to go live, and he had to move everything over to a new one, and he's in a different office, so the lighting doesn't work, and everything else has gone haywire from that. We will try and get hold of the slides so we can put those online, so you can see some of those. But while we were speaking, I did Google a few of the images as we went. So I shall try and bring those up for you. So this is a copy of the book that we were talking about. But it's a photo from the 60s or the 70s.
The publisher never told me very much about this. It looks, I mean, that was their choice. I had a different one, but they couldn't make it work. But that looks like it may even be from the late 50s.
Yeah, yes. So, you know, this wonderful mix of presumably British children and presumably immigrant Indian children. We have also got here the image you were talking about of the from Mayhew, of the Jewish old clothes hawker. Gertz, the butchers, and this is apparently in Newham, and there was a parallel image to that this is before the First World War, and when the First World War broke out, a lot of the Jewish butchers and had their windows broken in anti-German riots. And then finally, not a very good one, but it's the first fish and chip shop, allegedly. So Malin was the Jewish immigrant who had the first fish and chip shop that we know in London in the 1860s, and known as Lee's. So there they are. I don't know quite how old that photo is.
No, Lee's is in Lancashire. That wasn't the first Jewish fish and chip shop. With that, right. I'll go into a lot of detail about that. I mean, you know, fish and chips is London, because it's the fried fish which is Jewish, and so it's definitely born in London, and anyone who tells you anything else is wrong.
Well, in fact, there's a question about fish and chips that has come through, and from Joe saying that why did Greek Cypriots become the next owners of fish and chip shops after the Jewish people moved on? Because there were a large number of Greek Cypriot chip shop owners, certainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Well, somebody asked me that last week, somebody who's doing another book on fish and chips with lots of illustrations, and one of the illustrations is going to be of me, which is very exciting. So the answer is, it's quite an easy answer. I think that the essence of understanding Cyprus and Cypriots is that despite the Turkophobia that exists in amongst the Greek population in Cyprus, the one thing that that the Ottoman Empire did was abolish feudalism. So Greek Cypriots are used to owning their own property, owning their own land, and being in charge of their own small businesses. So all that happens in a sense is that they move from managing their land in Cyprus and their household in Cyprus to taking over small businesses. And it's partly, some of them move into the rag trade, which was Jewish before, and some of them move into fish and chips. And I think what essentially happens is sociologists would talk about ethnic clustering. So because one Greek Cypriot does it, another Greek Cypriot does it as well. So some of my parents and uncles' friends own a fish and chip shop. And actually, if you leave London, you almost invariably find Greek Cypriots solely. Almost the only reason Greek Cypriots left London was to open up fish and chip shops. So lots of the fish and chip shops in Leicester are owned by Greek Cypriots, and that's replicated in. I remember being in Liverpool about 30 years ago and went to a fish and chip shop, and it was owned by a Greek Cypriot. So it's partly a London phenomenon, but Greek Cypriots in London are a bit more diverse than they are outside London in terms of their occupations.
Totally. And another question, this one from Moira. Has there always been migration from Ireland to London? Was there a big Irish presence here before the famine? We know about the coming over in the 18th century, but was there a big Irish presence before the sort of Victorian era?
Well, there's one book that takes it back to the 13th century, but I think it's continuous. But I mean, the famine, in a sense, changes everything because of the scale of migration that takes place as a result of the famine. But I mean, if you read one of the classic accounts of Georgian London, has a section on the Irish in London. So yeah, they have always been present. I mean, actually, I'd probably argue that the two groups that have almost always been present are the Irish and Jews. Of course, there's the expulsion of 1290 and the readmission of 1655. So that's not quite true. So Irish and Jews are the groups that have been here for the longest, if you like.
And also someone's asking, scrolling back a bit to some of the early questions. When does a migrant stop becoming a migrant? Is it second generation, third generation, or sort of defined by the person? Because London, I know, has always been a city of migrants, even if it's internal migration. It grew from people coming to London from outside of London, the rest of the UK. And it's always struck me that London's a sort of, you are a Londoner if you believe you're a Londoner, wherever you've come from. But is there a point at which someone stops being a migrant and becomes whatever? I can't think how to vocalize it.
Well, I'll give you a personal answer and a cheeky answer. So the personal answer is whenever I'm abroad and people ask me, where are you from? I always say I'm a Londoner, because I feel much more comfortable saying I'm a Londoner than saying I'm British, because that has all sorts of connotations for someone who's of migrant background. I mean, I won't, in a sense, I'm comfortable saying I'm British because Britishness is constructed as a result of the empire than saying I'm English, which I wouldn't say I was English, but I can say I'm British, but I like saying I'm a Londoner. But maybe we can give the example of Priti Patel, who I think is a Londoner. And the cheeky answer I want to give is maybe, you're no longer a migrant when you hate the next set of migrants who want to come in, or in her case, even when you want to prevent them from coming in and put them on boats in wherever she's going to put them on.
Yeah, no, I mean that is a, we know from the stats that a lot of second, third generation immigrant families voted Brexit because they felt that they're threatened by the latest wave of migration, even though they were a couple of descendants from a couple of generations before of migration. It's an interesting phenomenon. And another question, was religious persecution a major reason for migration to London? Was England, Britain known for religious tolerance, or were the factors that generated migration other parts of it?
Well, I think the group you probably, actually, if you go back to the 16th century, it's in, yeah, it is. I was going to give the Jewish example, but it's not just the Jewish example. It's also the Huguenots. And in the 16th century, you have a lot of people fleeing people who were persecuted as a result of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation coming to London. So people who are persecuted because they changed to a Protestant religion end up in London, and the Austin Friars Church is established. I mean, the better known group is Jews. So you have some accounts of German Jews who have this imagination of London exactly the way you described it. It's a city of tolerance. And then some of the Jews who come from Russia at the end of the 19th century, I mean, they're fleeing pogroms. They may also be fleeing poverty, but both factors are in operation. And then probably the one we know best of all, the religious group, although they don't actually see themselves as particularly religious, because they become quite secular by that time, are the Jewish refugees from the Nazis, who are actually racialized. So their religion is turned into a race. So yeah, I mean, religious persecution is important. Since the early modern period.
And there's a interesting question here about whether there's a difference in perspective or attitude of those migrants who have been fleeing but intend to return. So distinguishing the experience of immigrants from émigrés, as someone quite nicely puts it. The post-revolutionary Russians, or the post-World War II, or Poles from World War II, who came to Britain fleeing one thing, but hoped, always imagined that they or their children would return to the motherland afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it might be simplifying things, actually, because I think all migrants probably, there's a book about Pakistanis in Britain that was published during the 1970s, and it's entitled The Myth of Return. So all migrants, whether they're refugees or labor migrants, if you like, imagine that one day they'll probably return home. I mean, my parents haven't returned home, but I mean, my childhood was, well, we had constantly had conversations about when we were going to return to Cyprus. I mean, it all fell to pieces after 1974 when the island was invaded. But I see where the question's coming from with regard to forced migration vis-a-vis voluntary migration. But I think even the voluntary migrants, if you like, the labour migrants, still have a dream to return home, although, and that does happen in very many cases, and it has happened with Cypriots, and it has happened with a lot of West Indians. So, it's not quite as clear cut, I think, however.
Mm. And I think one final question, a point someone's making, and whether this is true or not. One of the reasons for diversity in central London was that Soho became the embassy quarter of London in the 18th century, which brought in, obviously different shops and trades to supply those embassies and different people. So the diversity of that. Was that the sort of spark of it? I know in the 19th century, Soho was incredibly poor, and the most of the immigrants were fleeing wars and persecution in central London. But was its original kernel based around a slightly more affluent incoming?
I'm not. Well, I haven't. I mean, I haven't come across that explanation, but I mean, I certainly wouldn't dismiss it. I mean, the period I know most about is the late 19th century, which is when the foreign restaurant, if you like, took off, and that. Yeah, I think that's got more to do with affluence, because it's right next to the West End, and going back to this point that I made about the size of the middle classes in Britain. So I mean, Soho, and if you want to broaden it out a bit more to the West End, is different from the East End, where where poor migrants go. I mean, having said that, a lot of the migrants in late 19th century London, going right through to the Second World War, are actually just working in the catering trade, waiters. I mean, they're absolutely fundamental in the development of waiting. I mean, the history, I once wanted to write a book about the history of the foreign waiter in Britain, because, foreigners from continental Europe have been fundamental in the development of waiting. And if you stick with Soho, it goes from Germans, French and Swiss at the end of the 19th century, then Italians, and then on to Greek Cypriots by the 1930s. And the reason for the change is the Germans are interned in World War I, and then the Italians are interned in World War II. So the next group takes over, basically.
And I guess that still continues. I mean, that if any of us remember going to restaurants and bars and pubs, young, educated East Europeans and even Western European students coming over here and working,
I mean, they're a mix, because some of them are professional waiters, because in Britain, waiting's something that students do and then grow out of it, whereas I think on the continent, it's a profession. German or French waiters do it throughout their lives, which is maybe why the quality of service in those sort of elite restaurants is much better. And I mean, even if you go to central London restaurants today, the more expensive ones you usually are served by a continental European waiter or waitress, I think. And I think the explanation for that is that it's regarded as a proper profession. And actually, I mean, one of the many tragic things about the state we're in at the moment is, that's one group that's really suffering, waiting staff, and then especially, these continental European waiters.
Yes, absolutely. And the sooner we can get back to we're all keeping our hopes up that some normality will return next year, but let's see how we get there. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for struggling on when the technology failed us all. Someone did put into the comments that actually they found it quite refreshing just to have a talking head rather than a whole load of images. But we will try and get the slides together so that those of you at home who've been listening to this and wanting to see those pictures, we'll try and get some or all of them online in the next few days. Just a reminder, next week is the virtual pub crawl. The week after